Okay, so here is a second video on government intervention, and I will draw for you a subsidy. We'll talk about a subsidy to suppliers instead of consumers, and discuss why this might happen, what the graph looks like, pros and cons, and the role of elasticity. So let's consider a market that you might remember from your first exam, the market for contraception. Let's talk about a subsidy of $5 to birth control suppliers. Because it's paid to suppliers, it's going to directly shift supply, but we know that it doesn't matter who it's paid to. All that matters is the elasticity of the curves. So let's think about birth control broadly, including all different forms of birth control, not just pills. Just the quantity of birth control and the price. I think that this is a product with very few substitutes, which makes the demand curve pretty inelastic, and I think it can be mass produced, which makes the supply curve pretty elastic. Together, these two curves determine the market quantity and the market price. So as far as why this policy might be enacted, it's probably because the government wants to increase this quantity, right? We know that with more birth control, you get less unwanted pregnancies, less children being born to families that cannot afford to take care of them. Society, you could argue, has a positive externality from birth control, typically in the consumption and not just the production. But we want to do the opposite of what we did last video, so we're going to pay it to suppliers. Because it's paid to suppliers, we'll shift the supply curve to the right. Now that they're being subsidized, at every price, suppliers will be willing to supply more birth control. That $5 is going to be the vertical height between these two curves. And at this new equilibrium where the new supply hits the old demand, that's where we get our subsidy quantity. So it did what we wanted. In terms of consequences, it increased the quantity in the market. Now we need, at that quantity, to find our two different prices. We look up to the old supply curve to tell us the price that sellers take home, down on the old demand curve to tell us the price for buyers. And that is the amount of the subsidy. That wedge between the two prices. Always, always in a subsidy, sellers are going to make more money and buyers are going to pay less, and Uncle Sam is going to step in to make up the difference. So for price, the buyers pay less, the sellers make more. Now, we could talk about the subsidy payment. They pay $5 times this many birth control units. So the subsidy payment is that whole green box. So the government loses money. Instead of tax revenue, we have a subsidy payment. Then we need letters to talk about the rest. A, B, C, D, and then everything in this green box. So everything in the black triangle of original consumer and producer surplus, and then everything in the green rectangle. E is really tiny, F is even tinier, and then G can straddle that black line because it's always going to move together. So let's talk about what was happening before at the market equilibrium and what's happening after the subsidy is in place. At the market equilibrium, consumers were getting A and B. Those are all the people that really don't want to have a child, so they would pay $100 for birth control. Maybe they only have to pay $20. Producer surplus is C and D. These are all the birth control manufacturers that can make it for only $1 and get to sell it for $20. And that's the end of the story. The total was A, B, C, and D. After the subsidy, consumers' price has gone down. Their demand curve is still given to us by this black line, but they now pay less for every birth control unit. So they get A, B, C, and G. They're better off. One of our consequences is consumer surplus goes up. We like that. Producers get D, C, B, and E. We don't pay any attention to this government manipulated supply curve. We pay attention to their true cost given to us by the black supply curve, and now their price went up to this price of sellers. So it expanded from C and D to include also B and E. But now, the tricky thing about a subsidy is producers are better off, but the government is spending money. And so in the tax, the government was bringing in money, so they contributed to total surplus. Now they're spending money, so we're going to subtract from total surplus. They spend that whole big green rectangle. So that is B, E, F, C, and G. That makes the total after the subsidy, once we cancel some of these letters, the B's cancel, the E's cancel, the F cannot cancel because there's no positive F, the C's cancel and the G's cancel, A, B, C, D minus F. That means the deadweight loss, which is total over here, subtracting from total over there. The deadweight loss is F. And in a subsidy, the deadweight loss is very different from the deadweight loss we get with the tax. This triangle F is all the extra units of birth control we get that cost more to produce than consumers value them down here on the demand curve. And we know those funds have an opportunity cost, government money that could have been spent on something that society valued more than it cost to produce. And that's the deadweight loss from a subsidy. Thinking about pros and cons, definitely a pro. Producers and consumers are both better off. If we think there was an externality, we increase the quantity, which is what we wanted to do. The main con is the government spending more money and this inefficiency that creates. So essentially, as long as you have the money to pay for it and you think that it has a low opportunity cost where that money could have been used, a subsidy doesn't have that many downsides for producers or consumers, only for taxpayers. As far as camera battery ran out. This is the amount that is paid to the sellers, right? This is how much their price goes up, B and E. This is the amount that's paid to the buyers. This is how much their price drops. So the relatively inelastic curve, the demand curve, the buyers benefit more. And that is one of our golden rules of taxes and subsidies. The steep curve, the inelastic curve, will benefit more from the policy if it's a subsidy, or pay more to the policy if it's a tax. And that's because the buyers are pretty price insensitive. In order to get them to increase their quantity to this subsidy quantity that the government desires, they have to drop their price a ton, right? Sellers have an easy time cranking out more birth control. Their price doesn't have to go up much in order for them to produce that quantity. But the inelastic curve, buyers that are kind of stuck in their birth control behavior, that want it at no matter what the price is, the price dropping won't change that very much for them unless the price drops a ton. So that is the role of elasticity. That is a subsidy. Hopefully that helps you guys.